right. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy end of the semester. Yeah, I figured that would. That's right. Well, welcome to the last talk of our fall colloquium series in January. I'll welcome you back for spring colloquium series. And this speaker really doesn't need much of an introduction because we all know and love Dr. Dan Bergan. So, as you know, Dan received his doctorate from Northwestern University in political science. He specializes in public opinion and experimental work on advocacy campaigns, primarily uses field experimental designs testing the impact of citizen contacts to policymakers on policy, ultimately. He's also done work in civic participation. We all heard at orientation about his project on getting the vote out. Currently doing a lot of work with Dr. Carnahan on misinformation and certainty in beliefs on misinformation. So we're really excited to hear from you today, Dan. And today he's going to be talking to us about promoting the youth vote, the role of informational cues, and social pressure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bergan.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Monique, for that nice introduction. And yeah, I'm talking about promoting the youth vote and thinking about ways that communication theory and practice can address this serious problem that we have. Or what I'm going to talk about is maybe as a serious challenge. I'm going to start off with a graph. A lot of my students have seen this before because I like this image quite a bit. It's by Charles Franklin, who's a political scientist who's interested in turnout. Okay? So I'm going to just focus on this red line here. This is turnout in midterm elections. Okay? What we see is the percentage of each age group plotted who turns out to vote plotted against age. Okay, so this is from census data, and it's based on self-reports, which isn't the best data for turnout, but it at least shows us some pattern that's going on. And you can see there's a really stark relationship there. We see is that people who are about 18 to 20 years old, they're voting at rates, turning out in midterm elections at rates of 20% or less. Okay? And basically, for every year that you're alive on this planet, the likelihood that you turn out an election goes up until you hit your, I don't know, mid-60s, 70s, something like that. Okay, so and then we kind of drop off as we get beyond, beyond the 70s as health issues and other factors kind of come into play. Okay, so age and turnout, there's a really strong relationship there. Okay, and so notice that the younger voters are really voting at very low rates. Okay, not only they're voting at low rates, they're underrepresented in politics. Because we see here, this is from Pew, and we're looking at kind of the population of the Gen X folks and millennials. They're kind of increasing over time, and the boomers and older generations are decreasing. Actually, the Gen X and younger generations have kind of passed that boomer and older generation in the around the mid-teens or so. Okay? So we have this underrepresentation of young people, overrepresentation of older voters, which explains a lot of things that we see in political debates. If you've been watching the Democratic debates, the first issue they're talking about is health care, right? They're not talking about climate change. It's why Social Security is the third rail of politics. You don't talk about it, you don't touch it. Okay, right? The third rail is not funding higher education. Okay? So that explains that. So younger people are underrepresented. The issues that they care about aren't really talked about. Okay? And so we care about representation, and we want to talk about maybe why these younger voters aren't voting. Is there a way to use communication theory, what we know about communication, to increase turnout? I want to take a minute to try to explain why younger voters fail to turn out in elections. Okay? And I want to talk about some potential explanations that might come to mind that you see a lot in the media, but don't really hold water. The first of these is interest. You see a lot of op-ed pieces that say, oh, younger people, they just don't care about elections, they're not interested in politics. This isn't true, though. Okay? You look across a variety of high-quality, nationally representative surveys, and younger people express comparable interest to older voters. Okay, there might be slightly less interested in politics in some surveys, but where there is a difference, it's probably not enough to account for that really big gap that we just saw a couple slides ago. Okay, so maybe in some surveys they're a little bit less interested, but it doesn't really explain this disparity in turnout. Another possibility might be civic education. Okay, civic education, well, there's been maybe a drop-off in the amount of civic education that young people are getting in school in favor of other areas. People just aren't learning about politics. Okay, that explanation isn't really that great either. As it turns out, civic education, as it's typically taught, doesn't seem to have an effect on turnout. Okay, so learning about separation of powers and the Bill of Rights and things like that doesn't really influence turnout. Now, there might be some other things that could be introduced into civic education, some other skills that might be relevant, but the typical civics curriculum is not really a good explanation. It doesn't seem like that is explaining turnout among young people. Finally, there have been a lot of efforts, when I say GOTV, get out the vote, trying to encourage younger people to turn out to vote, and those, a lot of those have had mixed results. At best, okay? So for example, efforts to use celebrities to try to appeal to young people, that doesn't really work. That kind of fits in with the interest. It seems to have the wrong theory about why younger people fail to vote. It's like, oh, they're probably not interested. If we can kind of attach a celebrity name to voting, it will encourage young people to vote. No, that doesn't really work. There are other things like online videos or even door-to-door canvassing, which has worked for older voters. Go and have people knock on the door and ask, whoever comes to the door, ask them to turn out to vote. That works. That face-to-face appeal, asking people to turn out to vote, works for older voters. The problem for younger voters is that they're really hard to reach. It's hard to get that face-to-face appeal for younger people who are more transient. They're harder to catch at home. Okay, so a lot of the get out the vote efforts are probably not going to be successful at boosting youth turnout. Okay, so we're going to think about, those are some possible explanations that don't really seem to add up. I'm going to talk about some other explanations that might be more effective in explaining disparities in turnout. One, as I just said, is that younger voters tend to be more transient. Okay, so if you think about our MSU undergraduate population here, we can have an undergraduate who is moving here to MSU, to their local campus address as a freshman, might live somewhere else during the summer, and then they'll come back to a different local address every year, right? So they're very transient. They tend to move around a lot, and even after leaving the university, they might hop around to different careers, live with their parents for a while, things like that. So very transient. That creates barriers to voting, right? Because at each new location, well, you might have to register to vote anew, find out where your polling place is, maybe learn about some of the local issues, and so on. Okay, so the transience is a problem. Younger voters have failed to form a habit of voting. If you've just turned 18, you don't have any experience with actually turning out to vote. Okay, and so there's no kind of basis on which to base that future behavior. Habit is kind of interesting. It's asymmetrical. So basically, if you turn out in a couple elections, like let's say you turn out in 2 presidential elections in a row, it's highly unlikely that you're going to miss the next 2. Once you are kind of a regular voter, you're turning out, whereas voters who fail to vote for a couple elections, well, they could always, there is a chance that they're going to change their habits and turn out in one of the next couple elections. Okay? But there's that habit. So the younger voters haven't formed those habits yet. Another issue is that there are social norms. The social norms for young people all point in the wrong direction. Right? We saw that plot of the age and voting, and we saw that everybody who's in that 18 to 25-year-old range, they turn out at very low rates. So you're looking around, you're looking in your social network, you're seeing other people who are not turning out to vote. Okay, I don't have to do the math for this crowd, right? That means they're not going to be very likely to turn out to vote themselves. So the social norms are all kind of pointing in the wrong direction. And then finally, there is some information that people have to learn It's not civics education, okay? It's kind of how to vote, dealing with some of the uncertainty around voting, having the internal efficacy to deal with voting. So where's my polling place? What am I going to have to do when I get there? What if the line's really long? What if somebody asks me for an ID? What ID do I need? All these kinds of questions that you have that might create some uncertainty, even some anxiety around voting are an issue. So there's some issues around learning how to vote. Again, that's not substantive knowledge about politics. It's about knowing how to engage in this specific type of behavior. Okay, so we thought about some of these barriers to voting, and we tried to think about how we know, what we know about communication and campaigns to try to address some of these barriers, okay? So our question is, what can be done to boost civic engagement and political participation among young voters? And we thought about a treatment that would involve a couple components to overcome some of these barriers, okay? The first one was information, providing information to new voters. And there's a host of evidence that providing some kind of election-relevant or voting-relevant information can increase turnout. For example, on a campus registration drive, there were some authors who provided brochures to provide some information about voting. Those seemed to make a difference. In Chicago, for local elections, there were these voter guides that were mailed out to younger voters, 18 to 30-year-olds. Those seem to increase turnout. On the other hand, there's some limits to information. There's some campaigns that have really merely provided information and have not done much else. Okay? Those have not always been successful. For example, there was a large-scale email campaign among a number of universities, emailing students multiple times throughout the semester prior to Election Day, and the emails would provide information about how to register to vote, how to get an absentee ballot, a reminder that Election Day is coming, information provided by email, okay, to a large, very large sample of undergraduate students. Had no effect on registration or turnout, okay? So information in itself doesn't seem to do the trick. We might have to think about how to combine information with other components of a treatment. Okay, so that's one component, information. The other has to do with kind of a broad umbrella. I'm going to call it social pressure and networks, okay? First off, we know that social norms relate to a variety of behaviors, and undergraduates who perceive that people in their social network vote are going to be more likely to turn out to vote, okay? Not a very big surprise there. Also, having political and election-related discussions with family and friends increases the likelihood of turnout. One of the kind of interesting thing about social networks as well is it raises the possibility of spillover effects or contagion effects. If I make you more likely to vote, you might actually in turn make your roommate more likely to vote. Okay, so that's kind of a big part of this social network, social norm component. Okay, the last part of this is really important though, is again, like there are limits to information, there are limits to social norm messages. It seems that forceful social norm messages can be effective in getting people to turn out to vote. And if they're not forceful enough, they're not going to work. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by forceful. There's a very influential study that was conducted a number of years ago here in Michigan. Okay, and what the researchers did was they basically took households in Michigan and they sent them a mailer. Okay? Now the mailers for the treatment condition involved a social pressure treatment. And basically those households were informed, they were given kind of a list of their neighbors and themselves. Everybody's vote history is printed on the mailer. So I can see my vote history. Uh-oh, I missed the last presidential election, missed a couple before that. And then I see all of my neighbors' turnout as well. Okay? And the mailer said, it's really important to vote. Here's kind of like your voting record as well as your neighbors. We're going to send a follow-up mailer after the election. Okay, so this is a very forceful social norms message. You're seeing how often your neighbors vote, and you know that they're all going to be informed about your voting behavior after the election. It worked. Okay, it worked. It increased turnout. But is that something that is ethical to do? Is it something that campaigns want to do? Is it something that we would want to do with students at the university? It might be a little bit kind of in your face. And this campaign, it was very influential. It was replicated a number of times. But it also raised a lot of controversy. Okay, maybe people didn't really like being treated in this way. Okay, so there was actually in the 2016 election, the Ted Cruz campaign actually did something like this in Iowa. People might remember seeing something like this. The Cruz campaign sent out this mailer to voters in Iowa that had something similar to this. It gave everybody a grade on how often they voted, and they saw a report for their neighbors as well. Okay, the same kind of social pressure treatment, and there was a lot of pushback for that kind of message, as you can imagine. A lot of people were upset about it. There are a lot of other problems with it too, but I won't go into that. Okay, but forceful works. There are also some less forceful social norms message. We just kind of give people some information about turnout that kind of makes them more likely to turn out. That doesn't always work, though. Just communicating the social norms sometimes isn't enough to increase turnout. So we want to think about how to be a little bit more forceful with social norms messages without maybe crossing a line of kind of being a little bit too in your face. Okay, so basically we designed a classroom presentation for MSU students that's going to address these two components, information and social pressure. The first component of the treatment is trying to reduce those information deficits. Try to inform people about how and why to vote. Okay? How do you register to vote? What does the process of voting look like? What are you going to be asked to do when you arrive at your polling place? Things like that. Okay? So that's the first part, is just reducing these information deficits. It's not meant to be, real political content or talking about a lot about the candidates or things like that. It's more just kind of the nuts and bolts of voting. The other component of the treatment is going to deal with social pressure, trying to increase the social pressure or social normative kind of message, getting people to turn out to vote. Also, kind of creating the possibility of spillover effects. Okay, then I'm going to not only cause this person that I'm talking to vote, but maybe their roommates or other people in their social network as well. Okay, so I'll talk more about the treatment in just a minute. We have some hypotheses from this. Basically, there's going to be, we had a number of hypotheses. I'm just going to talk about the main ones here. Okay, so first off, we think there's going to be direct effects. We're going to have individual students that are exposed to this classroom treatment that provides information about the election and social pressure kind of message about the election. People who receive those messages are going to be more likely to turn out to vote. Our second hypothesis has to do with spillover effects. Okay? So we have a special message that's designed to increase social pressure, and we think that that's going to affect the roommates of those who were in the classroom to receive the treatment. Finally, we have some other questions. We're going to take a look at whether the effects have whether they differ based on whether students are already registered to vote by the time that they're treated. So you can imagine if somebody's already registered to vote, first off, they've already paid that cost. They've already taken the time to do that, so that's one less hurdle that they have to cross to turn out to vote. Also, it might be signaling something about their interest in politics as well. They at least have the minimal level of interest that they're already registered to vote. Okay, so we want to take a look at whether the effects differ based on whether people are already registered to vote by the time they receive this classroom treatment. And we're also going to look at some other non-voting behaviors that could be influenced by this treatment. Okay. So we set up a field experiment, and we're going to take a look at sections of the first year writing class. Okay, so we basically kind of reached out to instructors of this first year writing class that's required of all first year students. There are a large number of sections, size 20 to 25 students each, all right? And basically they're first year students, so most of them are about 18 to 20 years old. Okay, most of them have not voted in the past. And this is a university required class, so we were able to get a large sample in there and reach out, get pretty large coverage of a sample that's representative of MSU students, or first year students anyway. And so we contacted the instructors and asked them early in the semester of 2018 for permission to do a presentation for the first few minutes of their class, sometime early in the semester. Okay? That's a little bit of a side story here. It was a little bit more difficult to get the instructors to agree to a short presentation than we thought there would be. And we said that, well, we want to just do a nonpartisan presentation on turnout. Some of the instructors weren't willing to participate in that. Also, there were kind of scheduling difficulties. I'll get to that in a minute. Let me talk about the experimental conditions a little bit. So there's a large number of control classes who were not treated. Okay. Next up, I mentioned there are two components to the treatment. One is an information component. That was a nonpartisan presentation where we had the students who went to go give those presentations. They talked about how to register and vote. They talked about some of the issues on the ballot. So you might recall in 2018, there was a ballot initiative on marijuana, for example. So the students were told that was going to be one of the issues there. Also, where to find more information about voting if they wanted to go find it. So that's the information component. Then, in addition to that, some sections also were randomly assigned to receive a social pressure condition. And in that condition, they were told briefly about how making a pledge to take an action can make people more likely to take that action. And they were asked to take a pledge that they would vote in the upcoming election. They were also given magnets to sign that, the magnets had a kind of reminder of the election date, and there's a space for them to sign to say that they plan to vote in the upcoming election. So not only did people pledge to vote, they also said that they would talk about it with their roommate, and they took a magnet for themselves to sign and also took a magnet for their roommate to sign as well. So let me talk a little bit about these presentations really briefly. This is just kind of one sample slide from the information condition, okay? Just some really basic information about the election. When's the registration deadline? It's October 9th. When's election day? When can they turn out to vote? So this is kind of like really the basic information that people would need to turn out to vote. Of course, there's more information on what's on the ballot and how to register to vote and things like that as well. Here's a sample slide from the social pressure condition. Okay? Research shows that making a plan and committing to vote increases the likelihood of following through, and you're the strongest influence on your peers' behavior. So they're told about some of that information on themselves and their peers as well. This is the magnet that we handed out. So this only went with that social pressure condition, that people were given a magnet to sign that could say, I pledge to vote on November 6th. Okay? And they were told they could display that in their dorm room. They were also given a magnet for their roommate as well. Just as a side note, I'm going to mention in a minute, one of the things we did to kind of check how these manipulations worked is we did do a follow-up survey with a number of students just to kind of see how this campaign worked out. And it seemed that the people in the pledge condition, a large percentage of them remember being asked to take the pledge, and a majority of them reported that they actually displayed these magnets. So it seemed like the treatment worked as intended based on those survey results. Okay, training and some of the data that we used. Okay, so we hired 6 students to do these presentations. So the presentations were done by peers. All right, so we asked the students to do this PowerPoint presentation, and on the scheduled day they would go to that section of the writing class and go in and make this presentation, the information or social pressure presentation, whichever they were assigned to do that day. Okay. We collected data from the MSU registrar, who has good data on a number of student characteristics. So for example, age and race and gender and kind of what classes the students were enrolled in that first year writing class, what section they were enrolled in. Okay, so we know who was assigned to receive which treatment. And we randomly assigned the sections to the treatment, but we now know from the registrar data who was enrolled in which section, so what treatment they were assigned to receive. For the election data, like on who voted in 2018, we actually took that registrar data and matched it based on name, permanent address, some other information. We had a vendor match that with voter data across all 50 states. So even if the student, their permanent address is in a different state, we still match them to their voter file. So we know who's registered to vote and who voted. This is based on actually the Secretary of State data from the 50 states. So it's official voter data. Okay, so it's a high-quality measure of people's behavior. We also invited all first-year students to participate in a survey as well. That could be, the results of that could be matched to the treatment assignment, so we kind of know, what treatment condition each of the respondents were in. We asked them some questions about their election behavior as well. I'll talk about that briefly. The survey is more indicative than definitive. The turnout, the response rate, and we didn't have any incentives to offer for the survey, so the response rates were rather low, but at least tells us a little bit something about the mechanism, some of the things that were going on as a result of this campaign, in addition to turnout information. Okay. All right, so our outcome measures are first off that validated vote measure, the official vote record data. You can see whether or not people voted. We also have some online survey items that were asked after the 2018 election. Okay. All right. So in this analysis, we used a linear probability model with robust clustered standard errors. We're clustered by section, right? So we have a bunch of students that are all receiving the same treatment. So we treated those as clusters. It's robust clustered because, as my 901 students know, the linear probability model leads to problems with standard errors, right? That's heteroscedasticity. Everybody can say it with me or not, but the robust standard errors should deal with that problem with the standard errors, okay? So basically, we're kind of trying to predict whether or not somebody voted or not. So that dependent variable is dichotomous. Okay, so we have a linear probability model. We're going to be able to show the effect on the probability of voting for this treatment. The independent variable is actually treatment success. Okay, so I should talk about this for a minute. We randomly assigned the sections to a treatment group. Okay. Now, some of those assignments didn't work out as planned. Basically, we had a limited schedule, and we weren't able to treat all of the sections that we planned to treat. Also, some of the instructors refused to participate. Okay? So basically, what do we do with those that were not successfully treated? They were assigned to be treated, but they weren't successfully treated. Usually, if it was at the individual level, and I go up to you and I try to treat you, but you refuse, I wouldn't just put you into the control group, because your refusal kind of tells me something about you. If I just put you into the control group, that's going to result in bias, okay? In this case, though, because it was done at the classroom level, the individual student really didn't have much to do with that decision to be treated or not. And we actually checked this as well, and we found that among all the control variables that we had, there didn't seem to be any difference between those that were successfully or unsuccessfully treated. So we took those classes that were not successfully treated and put them into the control group. So the independent variable is if your class was successfully treated. And later on, we're going to look at the roommates and see if you had a roommate that was successfully treated. A number of controls. We ran the models with and without controls, age squared, some race variables, gender. Course type, some of the sections were honors sections. We might expect those students maybe to be more likely to turn out to vote. We controlled for that. Also for the roommate analysis, we controlled for the number of roommates. Okay, so finally we get to the results here. So we're going to start off with the full sample. This has to do with the direct effect of the treatment. So we took all first-year students, and we tried to see if being successfully treated had an influence on their likelihood of turning out to vote. Okay, so we analyzed this a couple different ways. The first model has no controls. The second model has the full set of controls. Okay? And we started off just kind of lumping those treatments together, the information and the social pledge treatment, put them together into just one predictor. And then we're going to separate those out later into info and pledge condition. So you can see here, basically based on those coefficients, they're small, they're not statistically significant. There doesn't seem to be a measurable effect of the treatment on likelihood of turning out to vote. So for example, in Model 1, the average effect of being success in one of those treatment classes has an effect of only 1 percentage point on turning out to vote. Very small effect, and it's not statistically significant. Okay? And the same holds basically across. It doesn't matter if we add controls to that or break out the info and pledge condition. Basically, all the estimated effects are really small and not statistically significant. Okay, so that was disappointing. But note that not all of these students are registered to vote at the time that they receive this treatment. As it turns out, about half of the students were already registered to vote prior to Labor Day, basically the start of the semester, prior to receiving any treatment. So we took a look at those students. What about the students who are already registered to vote? They've already paid the cost of getting registered to vote. It might also tell us a little bit of something about their level of engagement with politics, that they're actually registered. Among those students, we did find an effect. So the first couple models there, we're just kind of lumping the treatments together. And it looks when we add the controls in the second model here, the effect of being treated with either the info or the social pledge treatment, okay, increases your probability of voting by 0.07, okay, which is a pretty substantial increase in the likelihood of voting when you compare it to other methods of trying to increase turnout. When we break things up by info and pledge condition, well, we can't really distinguish the effects of those. It looks like maybe the pledge condition has a slightly stronger effect, but we can't really distinguish those statistically. Okay? But okay, so again, if we limit the sample to those who were already registered prior to Labor Day, it looks like there was an effect of the treatment on their voting behavior. All right, those are people who are exposed to the treatment directly, right? What about the roommates? So I'm going to move over to this sample is a little bit different. It's everybody who has at least one roommate who was in the first year writing class that semester. Okay? So you're included in the sample if you had at least one roommate who took any writing class. Okay? Your treatment equals 1 if at least one of your roommates was exposed to a treatment in that writing class. Okay, so if your roommate was in a first year writing class, okay, you're in this sample. If they were assigned to the treatment, you get a 1 for that variable, 0 otherwise. All right, so here we're looking at the spillover effects. If I had a roommate who was in that treatment class, am I more likely to turn out to vote? And again, there's nothing really going on here. This is the full sample. Okay, there's basically really small statistically insignificant results here. What happens when we turn to the roommates who are already registered? Again, they've already paid that cost of registering, and they at least have a minimal level of interest in politics. Now things get a little bit more interesting. We lump the treatment together. We don't really see that much, but we pull out the effects of the info and the pledge treatment. We see that if my roommate was in one of the sections that received that pledge, they pledged to vote and talk about it with their roommate. They were told it's really important to share this information with peers. They got the magnet that they signed and could go on to display in their room. That roommate pledge increased the likelihood of voting. Your probability of voting increased by 0.08 or 0.09. Okay? Which again, compared to other types of campaigns, get out the vote campaigns, is a pretty large effect. Okay? And so it's kind of interesting too. It's like if my roommate received just the info treatment, they weren't told to talk about it with the roommate, they didn't sign a magnet or anything like that, there's basically no detectable effect. But if my roommate got that social pledge treatment and were encouraged to talk with their roommate and got the magnet, then I become more likely to turn out to vote. So we're really excited about this result. We want to replicate this result. We also wanted to learn a little bit more, and we collected this survey, and basically the response rate was lower than we would have liked. We didn't have incentives to offer, but we basically took the emails we had from the registrar, sent out an email inviting all first-year students to participate in this survey. And here, we're not looking at roommates. We're just looking at people who were directly exposed to that treatment. And I just lumped together the treatment groups, again, just because we had a small sample size. We had a small number in the info, small number in the social pledge group. We just kind of lumped them together into one treatment to look at the effects on different behavior. So in that survey, we asked people whether or not your roommate voted, whether or not you discussed politics with your roommate, whether or not you persuaded somebody else to vote in the election, whether or not you consume news, and whether or not you participate in a number of other ways. Okay? I mean, long story short, there's a lot more to kind of think about here, but the positive and large effects seem to be for consuming news. If I was treated with that info or social pledge treatment, I'm more likely to consume news leading up to the election, and also participating in a number of other ways. We asked people a number of items. Did you participate in a protest? Did you display a campaign button? Things like that, okay? Kind of put them together into an additive scale, 9 different behaviors, asked how frequently they did these things. It seems like receiving any treatment had an effect on not just voting behavior, but also other behaviors as well. Okay. I want to talk about the results a little bit. First off, there have been other efforts to have a classroom intervention encouraging young voters to turn out to vote. Ours confirmed that this can work if crafted correctly. We can actually overcome some of those barriers that young voters have. We've also provided one of a few demonstrations of contagion effects in get out the vote drives. If I encourage you to turn out to vote, that can have an effect on your behavior, but also on other people's behavior. And this treatment that we just talked about was unique in that it was designed to have that spillover effect. We're trying to encourage conversations between roommates. It's also a template for future college campus get out the vote drives. One thing that would be helpful to us, in the Q&A today, or just generally if people have any thoughts about this, is that we want to move forward to think about this a lot more. One of the things we could get at this a little bit with the survey, but we want to think more about it, is first is what is the mechanism by which this treatment, especially the spillover treatment, is operating? Okay, how does it work? Are the students more likely to engage in conversation? Do they just kind of notice that somebody else put up a magnet and make some inferences about their roommate, or what? What's the mechanism going on there? Potential moderators for this effect. Is this kind of treatment more effective with certain types of people? Maybe extroverts or people who don't mind conflict or something like that. We did look at some of this. We thought, based on some of the prior literature, that this kind of spillover treatment might be more effective with females than males. We didn't find any evidence for that here. Also, it might be interesting that there might be a spillover not only in space to your roommates, but also in time. If we encourage people to turn out in this election, maybe they'll be more likely to turn out in 2020. That'd be something that'd be relatively easy for us to take a look at. And also moving forward here in Michigan, remember one of the hurdles for this study was the treatment varied by registration status, right? It was effective for those who were already registered. How is that going to change now in Michigan, where we have same-day registration in 2020? Maybe that barrier will be eliminated. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and especially I really want to mention a number of our partners, especially the Michigan State Service Learning and Civic Engagement, who have really started to take an interest, a strong interest in putting a lot of effort into encouraging younger voters to vote. One of the really interesting things that they've been involved in is registering first-year students to vote, during freshman orientation and things like that. So they've been a really helpful partner in this, in trying to really help us kind of get in and do some of this presentation and providing some of the funds behind this project. So appreciate their help a lot, and I'll look forward to any questions that people have. Yeah, Sandy.
You were talking about descriptive norms, and obviously there was no norm that was descriptive of that younger group voting. But I'm wondering if you move to injunctive norms, and you could see if that group approves of voting. And if that is the case, if 51% or more of the population of interest approves of doing something, then I think you could use injunctive norms as a way to move towards your goals.
Right. I think that's a fair point. Yeah, like I said before, the descriptive norms are challenging, right? Because the existing, the existing population, yeah, right, exactly. But the injunctive norm might be the way to go in creating a stronger message.
If it is out there, you have to find out.
Well, I mean, some of the survey research I was talking about might be indicative of that. It seems that students are interested in politics, right? But they're not turning out to vote. So you can see that, that's not exactly injunctive, but it kind of suggests that the injunctive and descriptive norms are kind of pointing in different directions, right? Kevin?
First, great job. Anytime that heteroscedasticity comes up in a conversation. So I had kind of a question that follows up. It's kind of related to Sandy's, but in the treatment condition, when you have the social pressure and commitment kind of thing, the results pretty clearly demonstrate that exposure affected, like roommates' exposure affecting individuals' responses, shows social pressure existing after that from taking the pledge. But the thing that I was kind of wondering was, is there social pressure for the individual to do that based on taking that commitment? Because, I mean, of course it's kind of like murky, and that's why I wanted to ask it, because our social pressure is totally within our own head based on what's around us. But to me, signing a pledge not in public, it seems like more kind of commitment like related for me, but it could also be very social pressure if it was like, I'm going to commit to this and then show everybody that I'm going to do that. And
I see. Yeah.
I was just kind of wondering if you thought that, like, cause it shows in the roommates that it did something, but in terms of signing the pledge, was it like commitment, pressure?
Yeah, so they were asked to, and Dustin, correct me if I'm wrong, they're asked to sign the pledge during the classroom presentation. Okay, so that is some level of public, social pressure rather than just commitment. So just to kind of clarify that. I mean, that said, you might have noticed, I mean, there was a big distinction between the social pressure condition and info for the roommates, not so much for the individual. So that's kind of an interesting thing, right? It didn't seem like the social pressure condition was doing a lot for people who were exposed to it. And so that raises, a question about how, what was the mechanism that was operating or failing to operate there.
So kind of a two-parter here to follow up on that. Have you considered the idea of switching this, like signing a pledge to sort of a publicly accessible online pledge source where you can say, because research has previously shown that most people believe online forums to be a public forum that people have access to instead of it, unless otherwise stated. So that kind of gets that public commitment there, but also that the not just from commitment, but the pressure of it being public and knowing that anybody can access it at any time and see my name is right there.
Right.
Might
So
be
encouraging people to, maybe even in the venue of the classroom conversation, encouraging them to go online and sign this online pledge. One of the things I'm a little concerned about that, and I didn't talk too much about this in the presentation, is that if I go and ask somebody to, here's an example around registration, okay? If I go into a classroom and I hand out paper registration forms, and I say, fill them out, I'll collect them at the end, that seems really clunky, right? But I'm going to get people to register to vote. If I go in the classroom, which we actually did, we talked about trying to encourage people to register to vote. So we went in and told them to do this, but gave them a link that they could use that was super easy for them to fill out, but that did not work. Okay, so somewhere between the in the classroom presentation and going online to do something, things got lost. So I think that is a treatment that could be developed and kind of worked out. I think that there is some logistics, even though it's a fine line. I think it's like once you ask people to go online to do something, you're losing a lot of people. Mm-hmm. What's that saying?
Unless you do it right in the classroom.
Unless you do it, have them do it before they leave. Please, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just curious of the decision to use a magnet as opposed to something like a sticker.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you're limiting the places that they can display these things. I mean, I don't know how the dorms look. Maybe there's a lot of metal, but so I was just curious as to why.
Well, I would think you need the permanency of the magnet. If you're going to do paper or electronic, you're going to throw it away. You won't remember the date. If you have a magnet, people don't throw away magnets.
Sure. I honestly don't remember why we chose this, but I'm going to go with Josh's explanation right now. Dustin, did you want to weigh in?
The logic was in the common area, perhaps you would have something posted on a refrigerator that's a public place. Someplace that people will go frequently, will see repetitively. A sticker you could put on your backpack or in your car or your desk. No one ever sees it. So the idea behind the magnet would require them to do something in a public way if they took the play. So close to Josh, and you don't throw more.
Maria, did you?
It seems to me that maybe so you had people who had registered to vote ahead of time might be a rough estimate of involvement. Some of our studies have shown that involvement moderates the effects of norms on behavioral outcomes. And it feels like people who pre-registered are probably more involved in the issue and are going to process things differently. And so just as one way to explain some of the findings, I don't know if that's how you guys talked about it, but.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the cost, right? They're kind of both part of that. I mean, one of the things that the registration, we can measure it pretty easily, but what is that? Maybe involvement, maybe also having paid the cost of filling out a form, right? I think it could be elements of both of those things. We might learn more about that in the future, with changes in the registration law. But yeah, I think we thought it could be either, but we can't really separate those.
Consistency explanation there as well, too.
So the two conditions, correct me if I'm wrong, is there's they get the information or they give information and also the social pressure message.
That's right.
So immediately my question had been, did you think about having a group where it was only the social pressure message, where you're specifically seeing the effects with people who are already registered to vote? In theory, a lot of the information piece they either already knew or had done at home, in future versions, would you reconsider that decision? Now we know there may be some kind of interaction thing going on there, or not, or it's only social pressure. Like, how do you see those fitting together?
I think our thinking around that was that the information seemed to be, in a way, kind of a precondition of getting the social normative message. And that you come in and you say, hey, there's an election coming up. Here's when it is. You know what I mean? I mean, at least some minimal information is required to even set up that social pressure message, I think. I mean, so, and I think we also thought that the information piece seemed to be pretty critical as well. I mean, it's hard to encourage people to, engage, sign a pledge and do all this stuff, but we haven't really talked about, well, where's your polling place? When's election day? All these other things. I think it just didn't seem like that social pressure would be as effective. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think theoretically, yes, we would like to see, separate some of these components a little bit more cleanly. I think we had some questions about whether that could really be done in practice.
With people who haven't voted, right, that seems necessary. The condition of knowing how to do it is that first hurdle. When you're only seeing effects for people who are already registered and have some indication of involvement, how necessary is that information, and how much more of it might be about social pressure seems really messy to unpick.
So you went over a lot of the factors that might contribute to the low turnout among younger people, but I'm not sure what would be their self-reported reasons, if they have any, for not voting. I mean, is there a discrepancy between these factors we think are influencing them and the way that they explain their non-voting behavior?
We have data on that. I don't know if I'm going to keep looking at Dustin, we looked at it, and I don't remember exactly. We asked a lot of questions about this. I think we haven't really had time to really dig into the survey yet. I think we were kind of focused more on some of these outcomes, but yeah, we did ask a number of reasons why they didn't turn out to vote. So I think we have to go take a more careful look at some of those responses.
Because, one thing I don't remember coming up was efficacy beliefs, for example. Like, I know a lot of people who say, well, I don't feel like voting. I mean, yeah, sure, I'll participate in discussing issues, but I don't feel like the actual time I'm going to spend in the voting booth is going to make a difference. I was just wondering if that was something that came up.
We did look at that one. We did look at efficacy, and interestingly, there was no difference between the groups. So, yeah, strange, right? You would think that in the information treatment, people would feel more efficacious, but based on our responses, I believe we explored that and we found no difference. So, interesting.
Yeah, there's some newer research on younger voters in particular, and one of the things that might be a factor in people actually voting that has been kind of difficult to tease out up to now is just kind of like following through on plans, or what in other research is called like grit or perseverance or something like that. This seems to matter. So basically we have these people who are interested in voting and they follow politics and all these other things, but it doesn't seem to matter in terms of their behavior. They're not turning out to vote. Okay, so maybe there is some variable that really hasn't been paid attention to a lot. It might be something like that, this kind of following through. So that's why I said earlier, like the civic education as it's taught now, but maybe if we could kind of educate younger people in terms of being able to follow through with plans and kind of persevering and these kinds of other things, it might be more effective. Winston.
Yeah, so currently all the unit of analysis is still the individual user, right? Because you have the roommate and the research subject itself. So maybe it's possible to do this kind of dyadic analysis, so that can allow you to unravel the underlying mechanisms behind the influence of the roommate. Say, for example, their roommate go to vote or not, and so the efficacy of their roommate in comparison with her own efficacy. So this may help discover something more intricate.
Yeah, the way we've treated it here exactly is we looked at the individual level, and everybody in the sample has a roommate in that class, but whether or not they were assigned to the treatment conditions. So that's kind of the extent of our analysis. But we could do more with looking at the roommate, dyads or clusters. Let's see, Monique.
I don't know if you're planning on replicating this in the fall of 20, but one interesting thing. That'd be awesome. One of the interesting things, since the entire nation was watching Michigan in the last presidential election, and it'll be interesting to see about whether or not these young voters were cognizant of that, and whether or not that cognition would moderate these effects, because that is a time for at least people to say, wow, votes really mattered. Right? It came down to such a thin margin in our state.
Well, so that's the thing. It's like efforts that have tried to do that, to emphasize the closeness of an election,
It doesn't work.
doesn't seem to matter. A lot of messages that you would think would be effective.
But don't you think that, I'm not going to word this in an academic way, but so much is different right now. It's like we're in the middle of like a massively historic event, right? And it feels like all bets are off right now about what's going to matter.
Could be. Well,
It's such a strange time, I guess.
it is a strange time. I don't know how much the average 20-year-old perceives that.
Me either.
too.
That's why I was thinking if you measured that, it'd be interesting to see whether or not they're cognizant of this would make a difference. But
Josh?
I wonder how much of this is affected by just how busy young people's lives are. Look at the election date, that's close to midterms for most universities. I mean, if you don't have the time of day to actually go and vote, then you can't go. Have that actually been looked at much?
So basically one of the models, traditional models for explaining turnout, is just this kind of resource model, where resource is broadly conceived to include time, skills, civic skills. This stuff, it matters, and so you can imagine that people who are extremely busy, that's going to matter for the turnout decision. Even things like, distance to your polling place can matter. That imposes more of a cost on voting. So yeah, I would say yes, that is probably a major factor for a lot of students. Let's see, so we're at 1:30. Why don't we do a couple more questions? Ezgi?
I think you kind of answered this question, but just to be sure, because you say you show them a link so that they can register, but you say it didn't work.
No.
So I wasn't sure how you calculate this, that it didn't work, but have you compared the registration rate before you do all of this study and after you completed the whole study and you didn't
So we know, we just took the students who were not registered prior to this presentation, and we looked to see of that sample, which ones registered following this presentation before election or before the cutoff date, and we found no effect for them.
There was no comparison with the after the election, right? Because I was thinking, if we are talking about spillover effect, and if their roommates has participated in this election, maybe after election talking with their roommates still about these magnets and things can affect their likelihood of registering for the at least following term?
It might be. I think we'll probably have limited data on that because we did the voter match after the election, so we're not going to catch that many people. I would think as well too, once the election is passed, well, you're probably saying, well, I've got a couple years before the presidential election, right? So it's not as urgent to go out and get registered as well.
Thank you.
So, I guess my question is about when we have these sorts of interventions, we have these treatments, like especially this classroom treatment. If everything like works out eventually, and you're seeing the numbers and the results that you're wanting to, the question then becomes, can we scale this? Like, is this something we can do on a broader level? And to Monique's comment about sort of the current political climate, how does that look to be able to say, we want to do a classroom treatment about getting out the vote, and some politicians might say, well, these are public institutions, and I know you say that that's a nonpartisan presentation, but next thing I know you're going to be telling me that facts are nonpartisan too. So we realize that you're just trying to liberalize these students. Like, how does this scale up in the current climate that might actually push back on the location of the treatment?
Yeah, that's that's a real challenge. I mean, I think a lot of these things that we see as nonpartisan, I mean, there's NSF research in political science is highly politicized, right? And so I think this turnout literature could easily be, so it seems like I thought you were going to ask a question about kind of the logistics of scaling, and it's like, yeah, sure, it seems like we could introduce programs like this at other Big Ten universities, other universities generally, maybe even thinking about classroom treatments for high school kids or something like that. But yeah, then there is kind of like the macro issues. Like once a campaign like this gains attention, it becomes politicized. So I don't know. I mean, I think, yeah, we call it nonpartisan, but really, I mean, the content of the presentation was nonpartisan, and we probably turned out a lot of Republicans to vote, right? But given the demographics that we're looking at, we can anticipate that it's probably push things more in the Democratic election. I mean, we don't have data on that, but just thinking about the demographics of the people that we're looking at, so I can imagine a study like this, an effort to scale up something like this, being politicized if we focused on younger voters. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I appreciate the questions and comments. Thank you very much.